I'm Sofia Caicedo, the editor-in-chief of the Yale Environment Review, and I'm really pleased to introduce David Roberts and Anthony Lazarus here tonight with us. David Roberts is a reporter for Vox News, where he writes almost exclusively about energy and climate change issues. Before joining Vox, he spent 10 years working at the news platform Grist as a staff writer, where he also specialized in energy and climate change issues. At Vox, David has written about everything from the Green New Deal to carbon taxes, solar microgrids, green cities, climate law, the coal industry, and a lot more. We're really thrilled to have him here with us tonight. Anthony Lazarus is the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and a senior research scientist here at FES. He is an expert on public opinion and public engagement with the issues of climate change and the environment. His research investigates the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behavior. He is also the host of the daily national radio program and podcast Climate Connections. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Lazarus and David Roberts.
Check, are you on?
Testing,
Check one.
testing. Okay, good.
Okay, I'm on. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, David, for coming across the country and spending a very intense couple days.
Yeah, you guys must be sick of me by now. I'm sorry.
Well,
you've been the same stuff again.
You've been bopping around the university, so I'm assuming most people here haven't already seen. In fact, let's just a quick show of hands. How many people have already seen him talk? Oh, look at that. You got a couple repeat customers. Nice. Gluttons for
They're going to realize I just keep saying the same thing over and over again.
So again, thank you so much, and you know it's a pleasure personally for me to have you here. I've been a follower of your work for many years. One of the lone voices of big picture sanity, I think, in this community for a very long time. So anyway, it's great to have you here at Yale, and looking forward to the conversation that we'll have with all of you. But let me start us off, and I'm going to throw you a bit of a softball. But it's a big picture question that I think you've got a unique vantage point on, and that is the state of climate journalism today. And just to preface this question, I mean, back when I first came to Yale in 2007, journalism was really getting excited about climate change. There was a lot of ferment, a lot of action. I mean, NBC Universal used to have Green Week, whatever the hell that was.
2007 bubble.
Yeah, I remember that. And then the recession hit. And frankly, it wasn't just the recession. It was also things, the business model of journalism was in free fall. 50,000 reporters lost their jobs. Whole vaunted, traditional news organizations went out of business. It was usually the science and environment reporters who let go first. And really, those were the dark times. We lost a lot of talent. And as you know well, better than most, these are not topics that you can easily parachute into without much background knowledge and actually say something intelligent or useful about. So we lost like a generation of really deep expertise in the reporting community. Obviously, things have changed a lot in the past 10 years. And as we were just talking about, it seemed this issue was a bit of a backwater 10 years ago. Could you say a bit about how you think things have shifted and changed since that critical 2008, 2009 time period?
Sure, yeah. I mean, wow, what hasn't changed? It seems like a different world. I was just laughing about that 2007 bubble. Me and Chip, my boss at the time at Grist, ended up in a glossy photo shoot in Outside magazine. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So surreal. Yeah, that passed like that, right? Like 2009, like where'd everybody go? Like no one cares anymore. But a couple of things about climate journalism. When I started, everything was a giant lump of environmental journalism, right? And I think it is a sign of health that is disaggregating a little bit into pieces. So like traditional environmental reporting was always mostly about local pollutants and those kind of problems, and mostly science-based, right? And that's what sort of environmental journalism was when I arrived at it. And I never did any of that stuff. So like it was always weird for me to be lumped in with that. But now sort of like, and then climate became sort of like a thing that environmental journalists also did. But what I'm seeing now is two things. One, a bunch of sort of climate being its own thing, becoming its own thing, climate and clean energy becoming their own thing separate from the sort of environmental lump, which is all to the good, and lots of reporters now on that beat and being assigned to it, lots of great young talent, like there's just like more out there to find than has ever been. And I, like really excited, especially lately, to hear more voices from non-white bearded wonk guys, people of color and more women entering and writing about it, which is just so refreshing and all to the good. And another thing I see happening, which also strikes me as a good thing, is, like I said, climate very much seemed like a kind of insular thing, not just in journalism, but also in politics, even in left politics. Like your sort of normal, modal, average Democrat will say the right things about climate change, but doesn't or didn't take it on board the way they did with like healthcare or something like that, conversant with it, understanding the stakes and the dynamics. And then there were climate people, right? And what I'm seeing now in journalism and in politics too is finally that mixing. And so finally the journalists who are writing about climate are tying it with the larger political picture, and the people writing about the larger political picture are taking climate on board as a serious thing. And it's starting to, what I'd like to see is like every journalist to be climate aware and climate informed, right? Because climate is everything, and everything happens within the climate, and so it affects everything, all political stories, all stories about real estate or migration or anything, like, so it should be, I almost wish there were less sort of like generic climate change pieces, which have become such a template now that they bore me to tears, and more just like climate being assumed and understood and informing the journalism of everyone else. Like I see that beginning to happen, and it's very, very heartening to me.
So,
and what's also cool is like, I never thought that I was making a smart career choice by going into this area, but like, it turned out to be super clever, because now I'm like on top of the world. Everybody cares about all the things I've been thinking about and reading about for 10 years, which I really did not anticipate happening.
So one of the things that you're talking about there is the diversification of the issue and the voices and the dimensions of the issue. And it's not just in terms of diversification of the voices themselves, but that people are, I think, increasingly connecting climate change to every issue, as you're saying. And so it now touches multiple beats. It's no longer just the environment section or the science section, which frankly was always page A23, right? Sorry to say, but science and environment have never been front page traditional stories. But it now touches the real estate beat. It now touches the national security beat. It now touches the sports beat in lots of interesting ways. And so as the story has finally begun to diversify in terms of all the different stories to be told, how do you navigate that? Because you can't do all
right.
that. So where have you decided to focus your...
That's a great question. I have a set of obsessions, a subset of, as you say, what could be like an infinite, like there's so many ways to go. Just one distinction is climate change, the phenomenon, versus solutions to it, which are a whole, even solutions to it, even that category is 100 subcategories, right? So mainly, I have never, I don't know if I should feel guilty for saying this, but I have never been interested in the science of climate change qua science. Like some people are into science, I'm not so into science. Like the science about climate change that you need to know to be politically informed can fit on a note card. We're super screwed. Better do something. So that's never been one of my things, like the science of like temperature changes and storms and all that stuff. I'm just sort of like content to let scientists work that stuff out and for journalists to synthesize it for me. And it's not that hard to keep up on what you need to know. It doesn't change much, you know, in short periods of time. So I've always been interested in the politics and sociology of it, first and foremost. There are certain solution areas that I am super interested in, like electricity and the grid and clean electricity and transportation and urban planning, density, all those issues. I have sort of like a side interest. I love those things. And the reason, and I think what sort of ties all the things I like together, and the reason I liked, like when I first was hired at Grist, they were just environmental. So I was, you know, I was raised by wolves there. I was allowed to do whatever I wanted to do, so I could have gravitated to anything. And I think I gravitated towards climate change, and the reason I gravitate also towards electricity and the grid is, you know, I was a student in philosophy for a long time in grad school, although it never amounted to anything. But I really like systems thinking. I like thinking about big systems and how they hang together and how the parts interact and what sort of emergent effects come out of them, just, you know, big systems. That's why I was attracted to philosophy in the first place. And so like, here's a big system, the biggest of systems that implicates almost all other human systems of all kinds, that is conceptually muddled in people's heads. Like, people genuinely do not know how to think about it, quite literally do not know what is the right vocabulary or framework in which to even understand this. So like, here's a place where conceptual clarity of the sort that like philosophers are trained to pursue matters in the world. Unlike in academic philosophy, anything I could have pursued in academic philosophy, here's an example of system thinking that like matters in people and is helpful to the real world. So that's a delight, and it's sort of the same thing with the electricity grid. It's especially as we electrify everything, it's so important and so big and so background and so foundational to everything else. And you pull a string in it, and you don't really know what's going to happen. You know, it's like lots of like system relationships. So that's fascinating to me too. Like, those are the sort of things I gravitate towards, the sort of big, capital B, capital Q, big questions.
So let's follow that with a little deeper then. I mean, look, you had a lot of potential topics that you could have focused on. So was there anything in particular that triggered this? Was there a eureka moment? Was there a key thing? Or was it just something that you were passionate about from the earliest that you ever remember hearing about climate?
No, I did not come in passionate about it. I mean, when I was hired at Grist, I was a total fraud. Like, I had no background in environmental anything at all and no particular interest in it. I just wanted a job that wasn't a crappy Seattle tech job. So it was all learning on the fly. And part of it is, David Wallace Wells tells a funny story. David Wallace Wells is a journalist. He just came out with a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. Highly, highly recommend it. It's short, easy to read, and is the best capsule summary of how bad climate change is that you can find. But he tells a story sort of like, he started reading the popular literature about climate change and then started investigating and talking to scientists. And it was the gulf between those two things that freaked him out and got him pursuing that. So kind of a similar thing happened to me. I read popular journalism and literature about climate change, and then I started reading about what climate change actually is and thinking about it. And to me, there was another gulf, which is just clarity, like good thinking, like, you know, like climate change had sort of come into the political world via environmentalism and was just sort of casually discussed as an environmental problem, which in US culture, environmental problem comes with a host of associations about who cares about it, about who's affected by it, about the policy tools to address it, about the political dynamics, none of which fit very well with climate change. but there was nobody, like I couldn't really find anybody puzzling through a better way to talk about it or a better way to think about it. So like, it's like, hey, philosopher to the rescue. Like, philosophers needed. This is not something you run across a lot in the world. So that's why, like, you know, slowly over time that sort of like dawned on me. But I was like, and especially like taking a few chances at grist, writing bigger abstract things, sort of like getting out over my skis a little bit and like exploring this conceptual territory, always brought such positive feedback. There's so many people out there, like, thank you for like putting some words around this, you know, like it's the weirdest public policy problem in that it is like a genuine intellectual challenge along with being a political challenge and an economic challenge and everything else.
Well, and certainly a challenge that as you've continued to plow this field, I mean, I actually can relate to this somewhat. Plow the field's not the right metaphor. It's surfing is actually a better metaphor, right? Is that we both came into this field around the same time. I go back maybe a little bit earlier to 1990. But nobody was focused on this. And to the extent they were, it was an environmental problem. And as you say, the only people who really care about environmental problems are, you know, people who live in Seattle with beards.
Environmentalists.
Right. With waffle stomping boots and so on.
And consequently, the sort of cultural image was, or the cultural sort of bargain was, if you want to care about climate change, you gotta put the Birkenstocks on. you gotta buy the whole package, the whole sort of environmentalist package. And most people just don't want to buy that package. Right. So, like, as long as climate change was bundled with it, most people did not buy.
And in fact, we've seen that in our work, is that filters through the way the media has traditionally, and even to this day, continued to tell the story. And we can actually see that because we actually measure people's associations to global warming. What comes to mind when you hear global warming?
Right.
And the single...
Is it ozone? Tell me it's not
no,
ozone.
No, it's not ozone. Though that's still there, and that's a whole fascinating story, but we won't go there. No, it's melting ice. It's sea ice on the Arctic Ocean retreating. It's ice shelves breaking off Antarctica. It's before and after pictures of glaciers around the world, which is useful in the sense that it does resonate with a mental model we all know, that you go outside on a warm day with ice, it melts, right? It's a way of reaffirming that, yes, global warming is real. But the problem is that it also reaffirms that it's distant, right? It's happening in the Arctic,
happening
in Antarctic,
to nature.
And it's happening to non-human nature. There's no human beings in all those images, and it really is the images that get associated with those articles. So a great article gets written about climate change, and then the editor says, okay, thank you. Hey, photo editor, give me a photo. And as a result, we have all been exposed over and over and over and over again to pictures of melting ice. And as important as that is, because systemically we know that melting ice is really important, but most people don't know that. And the fact is how much time do any of us spend watching ice melt, right?
Well, this was David Wallace-Wells' whole thing. He's like, when I read the literature about this, or the popular literature about this, it's all glaciers and sea level rise.
Right.
That's like but he's like, what about the heat waves and heat death and drought and agriculture and migration? He's like, all these things are undertold stories.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's still true. Like I may have exaggerated how much things have evolved. Like it's still maddeningly true that journalists who are not in this full-time, this area, doing the parachuting in thing, just adopt all the tropes of the environmental story still. They still do. And even activists out marching are like, save Mother Earth. I'm like, would you please quit that? No one cares about that. You care about that and your friends care about that. How about like save Lower Manhattan? How about like save the US economy? Save like your children's chances of living a better life than you live. You know what I mean? Of all the things.
Not save the whales, save the humans.
Yeah, Mother Earth. I don't know. I think that's changing. I think and hope that's changing.
Okay, so let's go to politics because that's certainly one of the beats that you've enjoyed. So let's go to a contentious question, and it's a question I see really playing out a lot within the climate community over strategy. And we can get into Green New Deal and all that, but that's not really what I'm asking about here. And that is that, look, if you look back over the past 10 years, longer than that, but really the past 10 years has been particularly bad, You've got two major political parties in this country, one that has increasingly become concerned and engaged with this issue, the other which has, certainly since the rise of the Tea Party, become pretty much purely obstructionist. And so now that we're beginning to see at least a few little glimmers of, at least happy talk out of certain Republicans in Congress, certainly not out of this White House, there is an ongoing, often unstated debate within the community over how to move forward, given the fact that time is getting short. And basically, if I can oversimplify, it seems to be two strategies. One set of activists or advocates argue, put all your eggs in with the Democratic Party, okay? Just go all in. You're going to go for the electoral wins. You're going to hopefully win the White House. You're going to win the Senate with a filibuster-proof majority, which we can talk about how feasible that is. Win the House, maybe eventually start to move the Supreme Court a bit back towards center, and you're just going to crush Republicans. It's just, they're not possible to work with them. Just steamroller over them to get the results. The other side says, yeah, well, that doesn't seem very sustainable. I mean, even if all those stars align and you can make it happen, our politics are still too divided, and that Republicans will take power again. And in fact, the danger is that you end up what we just have seen. One party, Obama's, passed a whole bunch of climate legislation, immediately followed by another now Republican president who's doing everything he can to destroy anything that just has Obama's name on it, let alone, because it's about climate. So then you get this whipsaw policy, right? And that's not a reasonable solution, because what you need to do is to ratchet up ambition over time. So they would argue that the community should be at least taking some of its resources and investing in building up the so-called eco-right as a way to get at least a modicum of bipartisanship. Just wondering what reflections you have about it. Yeah, well, if you could solve it, that'd be great. But you must have reflections on it.
Oh, so many. Very well put. Very well put question, and I do think it is the core strategy question right now, and is the core political science question, really. And I don't want to drag everything back to the Green New Deal, but the Green New Deal is very much a existence proof, an attempt at an existence proof for one of those strategies. So I would say a couple of things. One is, when Obama took power, Mitch McConnell vowed to block everything Democrats tried to do. And then he did that. And he did it 100% consistently, with virtually no exceptions, for 10 years now, and is continuing to do it. So, to me, if your argument is maybe sometime Mitch McConnell's going to stop doing that, you got the burden of proof, right? All evidence points toward they chose 100% obstruction as a strategy. And this is what I think a lot of people on the left don't necessarily appreciate, or even a lot of people in American politics don't appreciate, is they chose that and it paid off mind-bogglingly well for them. As repugnant a strategy as you might think it is from a sort of civic point of view, from a political point of view, it absolutely worked beyond their wildest dreams. They blocked Obama from doing hardly anything, and got their own president and got Congress. Everything that's happened to the Republican Party in the last decade only serves to reinforce the fact that they were right to approach U.S. politics as a zero-sum game. That's how Mitch McConnell sees it. And honestly, that's kind of how it's structured to be. So Mitch McConnell realized accurately, if I cooperate on anything, it gets coded as a victory for Obama, and anything that is a +1 for Obama is a -1 for us. That's just the math. So I will not allow Democrats any victory, right? And so that's what he's going to keep doing, right? So the strategy or hope of which has been the core Democratic strategy for decades now, plugging away at the center, trying to start in the center and building a coalition out from there, that is the theory of change that Obama came into office with. Like, there's a great, I already told this to one crowd, but I might as well tell it again. There's a great interview on Vox right now with an economist, Brad DeLong, who was part of the administration that came in. He calls them the Reuben Democrats that came in with Obama. And their whole theory of the case was, we identify moderate, movable Republicans. We make policy concessions so as not to offend their sensibilities. We build a coalition starting there and moving out from the center with Mitt Romney's health care plan and John McCain's cap and trade policy and George H.W. Bush's tax policy. And what they found was they got the stiff arm. They got none of those. John McCain and Mitt Romney and George H.W. Bush never said a single kind word about Obama the entire 8 years he was there. So the strategy was tried in the most concerted, best circumstances in which it could possibly have been tried and failed spectacularly over and over again. The only reason it's still even taken plausibly at all is that something about the people on the left, they just love persuasion. They love words and talking and arguments and persuasion. And oftentimes when you ask someone on the left about political strategy, they just conflate that with persuasion. It's almost like they see persuasion as the whole category. Like the idea of behaving like Conan the Barbarian and crushing your enemies before you and causing their women to lament and whatever it is, the Conan quote, what about that? What about winning? What about crushing your enemies and winning? So that strategy's been tried, right? What the Green New Deal is doing is not exactly how you characterize your latter strategies, not just doubling down on Democrats. It's quite different from that. There is an inside game attempting to get Democrats on their side and work from the inside. But the key strategy of the Green New Deal and the key sort of third option here, with the first two having both proven impossible, is an outside-in strategy, is people power, right? Is the only thing that's going to, you're right, as long as, and this is something I keep saying, you're right that the way the system is currently constructed is going to produce failure over and over again and gridlock over and over again. That's it. So the status quo leads to disaster. And that's true even if Dems win in 2020, if they take the presidency in both houses of Congress. As long as the filibuster is in place, Mitch McConnell will have the power to block anything that comes to Senate, and he blocks everything he has the power to block. So when Cory Booker says, I'm gonna, use my sweet powers of persuasion to get 7 or 8 Republicans to sign on to my bills, no, you're not. You're just not. Nothing, as long as the filibuster remains in place, nothing's going to pass, period. We just gotta come to grips with that. So it's not just you have to change who's in power, you gotta change the dynamics, the power dynamics of the system overall. So you gotta kill the filibuster. You really got to. You've got to make DC and Puerto Rico into states and get them in the Senate so they can vote in the Senate. You've got to pass automatic voter registration and other voting reforms so that the natural majority of Democrats translates to a political majority of Democrats, like democracy or something. And those things have got to be done, or else we're going to end up in the same static situation we're in. And the problem is older Democrats, your sort of Hoyers and Pelosi's and Schumers, they won't say so explicitly, but the idea of just returning to the Obama status quo, where they're in charge and they're the adults in the room and they get to propose all sorts of exciting sounding things, with none of the risks of anything passing, right?
Right.
They just get to propose great things, and then those mean Republicans block them, and we have our competing press conferences, and we have another 8 years of Obama when nothing passes, right? The last 6 years of his presidency, he had nothing to do but use his executive powers. Hilariously, I just saw a story in Politico 2 days ago about Trump has decided Congress is too dysfunctional, and he's just going to rely on his executive powers now. The institution doesn't work for anyone. So, you know, we've got to have a big, sweeping reform agenda. And coupled with this, on the other side, that's half, call that half the Green New Deal thinking. The other half is, all right, let's work backwards, right? The current power dynamic doesn't work. It's going to produce frozen gridlock. What sources of power do young progressive activists have that might change that power dynamic? They don't have fair representation in Congress. They don't have reliable billionaires. They don't have a giant media apparatus that is devoted to serving as their propaganda arm. What's left? What do they have? People power. That's it. Like people in the streets. That's the only power to which they have any access. So if people in the streets are the only thing that could possibly overwhelm congressional laziness and dysfunction, how do you get people in the streets? Well, carbon policy alone in isolation just isn't going to do it. There's not enough people who care passionately or have the time to care passionately to create a movement out of. Like, you're not going to get working people, you know, like who are worried about their next paycheck to come out and fight for those polar bears. So, I mean, so here we have two. So the idea is, don't go narrow on carbon policy like the wonks want you to, like the economists keep telling you to do, like the centrist Democrats keep telling you to do. Go big, go broad, bring in massive public investments, job creation, offer work to anyone who wants it. Promise the people, if we go through this massive transition that we're proposing, we're not just going to leave you hanging out there in our current craptastic healthcare system where your healthcare is tied to your job. P.S. We're going to destroy whole industries and create new ones and move people around the country to different regions. But good luck, you know. So we're going to protect your healthcare. We're going to make sure we go through this together, and you'll be protected, and you'll be part of it, and you'll have a valued role in it. This national purpose, right? This maybe can appeal beyond traditional political categories, right? Beyond traditional political cliches, can get people in the streets and is getting people in the streets. So you're right, it's the sort of political science question of our time. You have the wonks and economists saying, narrowcast, don't bring in these other issues that are just going to trigger Republican opposition. Narrowcast, get those little glimmers you see on the right, blow on them, you know, fan them, don't do anything too quick to create a draft that might, you know, which we've been trying to do for 10 years, or just go big, right? And go big and broad and try to get enough public sentiment that you have an exogenous force that is changing that status quo power balance. Because this worry about flipping back and forth is most applicable to policies about which the public doesn't care much, and about which the public is not very engaged, and about which they don't know much, which is narrow carbon policy and like tweaks to Clean Air Act rules and things like that. Like, public is not going to rally to protect those things. But if there's a big public movement to force a change, that dramatically increases the risk of trying to undo the change, right? So that if you can permanently change the balance of powers, then you at least begin to address that very real problem.
So you have a few thoughts about that.
That's my preface. Now, chapter one.
Chapter one. So I think there's a lot that we would certainly agree with in terms of our analysis, and it's why we've in part spent a lot of the past 5 or 6 years looking at what leads people to become engaged citizens and actually build a powerful 21st century movement. So I'm not even convinced it's people in the streets anymore, to be honest. I think those
Twitter?
marches
People on Twitter?
They have no.
I joke.
No, it's about building. The political science term for this is issue publics. Whether we have a relatively small proportion of a population who are passionate about a topic and organize. I mean, it's really about organization. And as I like to say about, somewhat sarcastically about the community, is that if you look against the opponents, it's like the difference between an incandescent light bulb and a laser. Okay, both about the same amount of energy, totally different outcome, because they're focused. They're highly organized and focused, whereas we're all over the place. We're diffused. We're often fighting with each other. We're the dim bulbs. Okay, and so really organization becomes a critical piece of this, and then also investment, because I think that's the other disease of climate community, probably broader communities as well, is that we're policy wonks, right? We're children of the Enlightenment. We believe that through dint of good economic analysis, political analysis, coming up with really clever policy solutions, and then taking an inside the beltway strategy, we can petition power to change, as opposed to what I think you're arguing is that it's more effective to control power.
Yes.
And until you have that power, you're up against other forces that are just going to be stronger than you.
Yeah. I was just having a conversation about this very thing. It's interesting, looking back now, the 40-year conservative propaganda campaign against government, qua government, against regulation, taxes, and spending, which are the 3 things governments do, was quite clever, and they're building up of an intellectual infrastructure which takes people from college through internships into institutions, a whole pipeline where they never see the light outside and become conservative warriors. Turns out it was smart to build that a machine. It also turns out that a nihilist message of anti-everything is super easy and widely applicable. It turns out it works on anything. So, for instance, if the left wants to pass cap and trade, right, let's start our march with a 30-minute seminar about what the hell cap and trade is and how it works, right? And then we're going to get super fired up about it. Where the right goes, oh, they want to do something? That's tax. That's a tax. Boom. The narratives are in place. The archetypes are in place. The organizations are in place. The army is in place. Just go, right? That's all they ever got to say. Go. And everybody knows their role, and they go. The media, Fox goes. The activists go, and it's always the same story, right? It's always the same model. It's always super easy to apply to any new problem. And you're right, the left has had no 40-year propaganda campaign in favor of government, qua government, just in defense of the ability of government to do good, right? It's always issue. It's all these issue silos. We want this, we want this. And they don't support each other. They don't act as a unified army. And so it's just this structural weakness compared to the other side. And what's more, what was also smart on the right's part is to spend those same 40 years systematically and deliberately destroying the mechanisms by which the left does organize, right? There's a reason they went after unions. Unions were what the left used to organize. Unions, liberal churches, like all the sort of social mechanisms, socioeconomic mechanisms by which people organized the left and gave workers a consciousness, a class consciousness, and a solidarity are gone now. And it turns out that organizing is just about the sort of banal business of getting people in a room together, right? It's very like tedious person by person work. It's just work on the ground, and they've been doing that work, and we haven't. And so, like, the left's mechanisms for organizing of the kind that I was referring to, a people movement, are withered. So there's a lot of work and thinking that needs to be done, in what those mechanisms could be today. Like, I'm not of the fashionable opinion that unions are somehow, outre, or like out of fashion or whatever. I think they still are great and still work great and still should be rescued. But like, we've got to have other mechanisms too. Just like Twitter is not enough. Like, how does the left order its army into action? No, there's no communication. There's no organization. So you just get people in a corner screaming action, action, and everybody else, ignoring them. So the G&D is more than just this strategy. It's also, I think, part and parcel of a larger strategy among young progressives to renew progressivism and renew the mechanisms of organizing and acting that the left needs to operate. Like, you cannot survive in politics on this thin layer of wonkery, no matter how good the wonkery is. Like, wonks don't inspire anybody, And like, for some reason, they can make it work together, but like, our wonks just crap all over our activists, Like, and our politicians crap all over our activists. Like, why does the left hate its left? I don't know. I don't get it. But like, so like, here we come. These Green New Deal activists produce this grassroots energy and momentum, and quite literally take it to Nancy Pelosi's door. Literally show up in her office. Hey, this climate change problem that you claim is a super big problem that you claim Democrats need to act on? We brought a serious solution and a grassroots army. And what reception did they receive from official DC? Snotty contempt all across the friggin' board. Just glib contempt, too. Not the kind of contempt that comes like, I studied your thing and I have contempt for it. Contempt like, whatever, no, we're not going to ban cows. Just not even caring enough about it to even read the friggin' 14-page document at the heart of all this, which takes all of 5 minutes. Just, I don't know. It's been both heartening in the sense that like young progressives are organizing, and the young progressives are organizing Conan style, like not apologizing for leftism or socialism, like not apologizing for caring about the public weal and public investment and a healthy sense of solidarity, not begging the right for approval or cookies, like fighting. But conversely, it's been depressing to see how alienating and bizarre the Democratic establishment seems to find that whole strategy. And like, I just want to ask Schumer, like, what's your alternate story? Like, this is what I've been posting. That's what my last post about is what I've been pounding the table about now for weeks. I'm fully acknowledge that the strategy of building a giant people movement and fundamentally changing the power balance in DC is a long shot. It's like you'd have to roll the dice just right 3 or 4 times in a row to get these things happening. It is a long shot. It's a Hail Mary. But what is the alternative? People keep saying, no, we need to build bipartisan cooperation and start from the center, but they can't promise that any of that stuff will pass either. There's no story to tell about which small things, in which small things pass. So to me, it looks like a bunch of nothing again versus a Hail Mary. And in that situation, I take the Hail Mary.
Okay. All right, we've got some time. Let's go to questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you. My name's Tanya. I have a question which I fear will lead to a sort of categorically bleak answer, but I see that you'll know.
Most questions to me lead to that sort of answer.
So I'm wondering, in Europe, I feel like the most bigoted person. There's a basic understanding that having healthcare is of some value, of having a functioning public infrastructure. There's some value to that. Whereas here, I feel you even need to make that argument, right? And I fear that the reason that's the case is that Europe went through such an epic tragedy with the Second World War that they had to completely reorganize themselves. And I'm wondering and hoping if there is a solution here that does not have to go through that epic tragedy.
Wow, that's an even better question.
Well, if I can actually add to it a little
Please.
bit, because that's the thing about the possibility, or even the analogy that's used by the Green New Deal, was the New Deal.
Right.
And the New Deal was a response to a particular set of socio-political economic circumstances, which was not just a Great Recession, a Great Depression. Millions of Americans were standing in line for soup, okay? And as a result, we're willing to entertain the idea of massive restructuring of society. So, you know, God forbid that we end up in that kind of situation. But is that likewise going to be necessary? Or are we children of the Enlightenment, and that we will, in fact, reason our way through in a more productive way?
The question is whether the discontent of the working class in America today is sufficient to produce that energy. And I don't know. Like, you know, like there's a lot of sort of low-level grinding anxiety and suffering, but not the dramatic, you know. So I don't know. And as to if I could offer the bleak answer to your bleak question, I mean, I feel like this is something everybody knows, but maybe we don't talk about enough. But why in the U.S., why has the U.S. never developed a social safety net of the kind that every European country has? Why has a sense of basic social solidarity not developed the way it has in so many European countries? And the answer, in a nutshell, is racism. The answer, in a nutshell, is that right-wingers, political corporatists, the capital class, convince the working class, whites, that anything they contributed via taxes to social welfare programs basically was tantamount to them handing over their hard-earned money to shiftless, lazy black people. That's always been the message, and it is still the message. I mean, go on Fox, go on some regional right-wing radio. The core argument still against social welfare programs is that they are exploited by and cheated by lazy people of color. And that has worked. It works again and again and again and again, and it's with us today. I mean, the Civil War never ended. That's why we're still into armed camps in this country. That's why there's no sense of broad solidarity. So the really interesting dynamic going on in the U.S. right now, above, beneath, behind all this, right, is the shrinking of the sort of rural and suburban white male power hegemony. They're losing their hold on society. They're losing their hold over all the power and all the money, and they are freaking the fuck out about it. And that's everything going on in the right now, right? Policy is out the window. Like, policy analysis is out the window. Like, reason is out the window. There is no political force more potent and dangerous than a group of privileged people in the process of losing their privileges. And there is no center between a group of people losing their privileges and a bunch of new people who would like a piece of the pie. That's not a policy dispute. It's a dispute about what kind of country this is. What are we? Like, are we a white male Christian society, or are we a multi-ethnic democracy that follows rule of law? Like, there's no center in that question, and that's just got to be hashed out. It's being hashed out. It's got to be hashed out. But believe me that every political issue in the U.S., including climate change, very much including climate change, is being filtered through that perspective. There's a reason that the first thing the conservative media said about the Green New Deal instantly when it came out is they want to go after the kind of trucks you drive, old white people who are watching Fox, the things you eat, your lifestyle. They are going after you. That's always the message. Like, they hate you and your lifestyle. They hate this tradition, the tradition of this country, and they want to transform the country into some sort of socialist hellhole, right? That's just the same message as all the other messages. They're all the same message, right? And all the political dynamics and all the political issues in this country center around efforts by that class of people to hold on to power. That's what gerrymandering is about. It's what the Supreme Court is about. That's what the Electoral College is about. That's what all these voter suppression things are about. All of it is, how does a shrinking minority in power hold on to that power? And there is no answer to that question that is commensurate with democracy, which is why they are very publicly abandoning their commitment to democracy, because white Christian rule matters ultimately more to them than democracy. And the argument for democracy was always subservient to the argument for white male Christian hegemony. All other arguments were subordinate to that argument. And there is no satisfying that. There is only defeating it and repudiating it permanently. Amen.
All right. I'm not happy now. Can we get another question?
Hi, thank you for coming here today and for your talk. I think personally I really needed to hear and just be reminded of what we're dealing with. So sort of the ironic thing is that you are in a room talking to a lot of the future wonks, the future senators, future executives. Like, that's who we become as Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And frankly, like, as a school, our administration has traditionally not really been a fan of people power directly applied to ourselves, as some people may have remembered from last year.
I talked to the fossil fuel Yale people yesterday. Yeah, I got that story.
So in relation to like how to change people, like there's not much room in what you've said for convincing moderate centrists, but within our own like left faction, and clearly it's very split, like what do you see as the main way to consolidate power, consolidate agreement, try to get us future wonks and executives and CEOs on board with people power, on board with that kind of organizing message?
Great questions. So many good questions today. Even that intra-family fight, I think, ultimately does not come down to persuasion. Ultimately comes down to power, just like all political fights. And so what you're seeing, you're seeing young progressives do it right now. That's what they're doing. That's precisely what they're trying to do. And they have an inside-outside game. Part of it is people power pressure on people who go the wrong way on these things, right? And part of it is an inside game of primarying people who go the wrong way on these things. And so basically, I feel like that class of wonks et al. Will change when it's in their advantage to do so. When the power structure is such that it's better for them to do so, and when the young left racks up some victories, right, to speak of and point to. And so that's just like, there's no easy answer to that. It's a generational thing. Like if you ask sociologists how to change the mind of a public, they will refer you to cohort replacement, i.e. old people dying and new people coming in. Sociologists don't believe anyone ever changes their mind. They're going to yell at me for that, but the point is, like, the new people coming in are already on board, and the older people going out are going out. So there's going to be some persuasion, and there's going to be power dynamics involved, and there's going to be pressure and clashes. But I think that's moving in the right direction, and I think it's just going to play itself out over time. Like the young politicians I hear from, like one of the few things in the last couple of years that's made me feel good is I hear now, I get emails all the time now from people who basically were like, I saw what happened in 2016, I got freaked out and galvanized, and now I'm running X, or now I got elected to my school board, or now I'm like representing my district, and these people are fully on board, you know what I mean, fully on board with, because they came of age. You got to realize that like Hoyer and all these older Democrats came of age in the era of Bill Clinton, in the era when liberalism was basically fundamentally in a defensive crouch, like apologizing for itself, apologizing for its past excesses, promising that the era of big government is over, blah, blah, blah. All of them are basically convinced that liberalism is unpopular and that if you want to get it through, you got to like cover it over and hide it in the tax code or whatever, you know what I mean? And so the idea of a muscular sort of out and proud liberalism is just alien to them. I don't even know if it's possible for them to bring themselves around. But people who came of age in Obama era and later have only known ridiculous, irrational intransigence from the right. There's zero that you could tell them, like, we need to learn from these people, or like their critiques make sense. They don't anymore, right? So I just think that's gonna happen. As with everything on climate change, it's hard to know if it's gonna happen fast enough, right? And it's hard to know how to poke it and prod it and accelerate it along. So, I mean, the best thing is like primary a few holdouts. I mean, nothing would change congressional attitudes faster than that. There's a reason that when AOC came out a couple of weeks ago and said, yeah, we got a list. We got a list of yahoos on our side who aren't doing the job, and we're going to primary them. Yeah, absolutely we are. And the caucus freaked out. Like, that is the worst thing you can say in the clubby Democratic caucus. Like, we're all in this little club together, and we're defending our sort of like privileges and our position here, and we're all trying to raise money together, and what the hell are you doing? But that, like, if they you know, like the Tea Party took out not a ton, and the Tea Party lost several attempts to take a few out, but they took one or two out, and that's really all it took to scare the crap out of the rest of them. And that's all it would take for these young progressives. Take a few, you know, like AOC defeating Joe Crowley made a big impression. A couple more like that, and like suddenly they will see the sweet light of reason about climate policy, you know what I mean? So, you know, power ultimately, I guess, is what I'm saying. Like, it's happening, but a few power moves maybe could accelerate it.
Well, so to go back to where we started, and we'll end up here, is that these are complex interconnected systems. And, you know, one possible way that you could see Republicans eventually leading the charge, or at least coming back to serious conversation, if not through reason and persuasion, is the loss of power. And that if you wander in the political wilderness long enough, you get interested in figuring out what it takes to get back. And there is actually an example of this across the pond, which is not a great example these days, the United Kingdom. But
Yes.
I'm talking, you know,
like
well over a decade ago, where essentially the Labour Party had defeated the Conservative Party over and over and over and over and over again, the Blair government and then the Brown government. And conservatives wandered in the wilderness for a long time as a party of climate deniers, until Gordon Brown said, you know what, it's time for a reboot, a 20th century reboot, and actually rode climate change as one of their top campaign issues, saying, we are not denying that this is real, we're not denying that it's serious, we just think that Labor has been talking about it but not actually doing anything. We're going to solve it with our conservative principles, and we will run the greenest government ever. Leaving aside what they actually did, but that was actually a critical part of their success in coming back to power.
Yeah, my only worry is that the structure of U.S. government is so anomalous relative to other developed governments and so dumb and bad. Like, there's a reason no new democracy looks around and says, what do we want? Ooh, that seems to be working. Let's do that president, two houses thing so that the president can have power and a public mandate, and a House of Congress can have power and an opposite mandate, and we'll just have no mechanism for resolving that. It's dumb and bad. So there are reasons our system is going to have trouble doing that, I think. You know what I mean? Because we only got the two choices. So I agree, and have been hearing people say forever, like, sooner or later, the party's going to lose bad enough to wake up. But look what happened after Romney lost. Remember the postmortem?
The autopsy.
Yeah, we need to like be friendlier to people of color and immigrants. How'd that go? You know, because America is America. It's got the memory of a fruit fly, and all of that went down the memory hole immediately, and we went right back to 50-50. Like, and they didn't have to change anything. They just doubled down on everything, and it worked for them. You know, so like conceptually, you would think that eventually there's going to be some kind of breaking point, right? Eventually the fever will break, as Obama anticipated and hoped for again and again and again and again and again. The fever will break, but I at least, you know, went into this election thinking, sure, the fever will break, and like we got influenza. So I no longer, like, maybe, probably, someday, I guess, logically that will have to happen. There's only so long a white male minority can cling to insanity and disproportionate power. But it sure looks a lot more stable than I thought, and that a lot of people I know thought. And I no longer, like, am making bets on it breaking on its own. You know what I mean? Like, ultimately, like, it has to be broken by a counterforce. It's not just going to burn itself out. Like, apparently, there is no level of ridiculousness that will trigger self-destruction. You know, like, they'll go along with literally anything. Like, Trump is an existence proof of that. There is no too far. There's no too dumb. There's no policy commitment. There's no commitment to decency, morality. There's nothing above tribe anymore. So I don't know what will break that, but I tend to think it will be organized counterpower that breaks it. It will not crumble on its own, I guess I'd say.
Okay, power to the people. All right, please join me in thanking David for spending 2 very intense and long days with us. So thank you, David.
Thank you, it's fun.